He went to the market to buy grain, but ended up buying a widowed Apache woman instead. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The town of Las Cruces stirred before noon, its market square alive with the noise of survival. Wagons rattled across the uneven dirt, wheels grinding against loose stones, and the bray of mules mixed with the shouts of merchants calling their prices for flour, salt, and beans. A low wind pushed dust through the alleys, stinging the eyes of those unlucky enough to be caught in its path. The air smelled of livestock penned at the edge of town, grain spilling from split sacks, and the sweat of men who had been standing too long in the sun. Nathan Cole dismounted from his horse with the slow, deliberate movements of a man who no longer rushed for anything. He tied the reins at a weathered post and patted the animal's neck, his eyes already scanning the wagons stacked high with oats and corn. His plan had been simple: buy enough grain to see his ranch through the coming cold and return before nightfall. He had counted the coins 3 times that morning before leaving his cabin, each clink against the table reminding him how little stood between him and hunger if the winter came down hard. At 39, Nathan carried the weight of years that had not been kind. His broad shoulders and strong frame spoke of a life spent working cattle and land. But his face told another story, lines carved deep, a stubble that shaded into gray, eyes that seemed to look past people more often than at them. He had lived alone since fever had taken both his wife and infant son 3 winters ago. Their graves rested behind the cabin he still maintained, small crosses tilting in the wind. The silence of that place had become his companion. He told himself he had come to town for oats and corn, nothing else. The crowd near the center of the square drew his attention before he could finish his errand. The sound was different, not the usual arguments over weights and prices, but sharp laughter, voices raised with a kind of glee that made his stomach tighten. He turned toward it, frowning, and pushed through until he could see. A small platform had been set up, the boards rough and hastily nailed together. Atop it stood a young woman with her wrists bound by coarse rope. Bronze-skinned, with long black hair hanging loose across her shoulders, she wore a deerskin dress that had been handled roughly. The neckline sagged where the seams had torn, exposing more of her chest than she would have chosen. The frayed fabric clung to her body in a way that drew crude comments from men crowding below. Some whistled, others shouted numbers. The auctioneer barked her name in a loud voice, Ayoka, an Apache widow, captured and brought in after a skirmish, stripped of her dignity, and now being sold off like cattle. The men laughed at her silence, speculating whether she would work in a kitchen or in a bed. Nathan's jaw tightened as he watched. He told himself to turn away, to focus on the sacks of grain he needed to haul home. But his feet did not move. Something in the way she held herself kept him there. Despite the ropes and the jeers, she stood with her back straight, her chin lifted. Her dark eyes did not plead with the crowd. They carried fear, yes, but also a steady defiance. It was the kind of look that pressed hard against his chest, the kind that made him remember standing helpless while his own family slipped away, powerless to save them. The auctioneer shouted a number, and hands went up around the square. Nathan's hand moved slowly to the pouch at his belt. He felt the leather warm against his palm. Inside lay the coin meant for grain, for winter, for the thin line of survival he had been walking for years. If he spent it, he risked hunger. If he didn't, he would have to live with the sight of those men dragging her away. He heard his own voice before he realized he meant to speak. $20. The crowd turned to look at him. Some laughed openly, others muttered curses. A rancher wasting money on a woman when the cold season was already creeping down from the mountains. Another man shouted higher, but Nathan raised again, his voice flat, unshaken. The bidding lasted only a few more calls before the hammer fell. Nathan stepped forward and handed over the coins. The auctioneer shoved the rope into his hands, smirking. Nathan pulled his knife from his belt and cut it once. The rope fell, and Ayoka rubbed her wrists, her eyes fixed on him. She did not speak, but there was no panic in her face, only watchfulness. Nathan tipped his hat. a small motion that was half instinct, then turned to lead her away. The wagon creaked as they climbed onto it. Nathan took the reins, and without a word they left the market behind. The sound of the crowd faded as the horse pulled them out of town, the wide plains opening up before them under the dimming sky. The ride was long and silent. Ayoka sat rigid beside him, crossing her arms over her chest to keep the torn dress from falling further. Nathan kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, the weight of what he had done pressing against him. He had left town with an empty wagon, no grain, no food for the months ahead. Only her. His thoughts circled the graves behind his cabin, the empty shelves, the nights that stretched long when the snow came. He told himself he had been a fool. But when he glanced at her and saw the rope burns on her wrists and the way she kept her back straight despite it all, he found no regret. By the time the cabin came into view, the sun had dipped low and the wind cut sharper across the land. The place looked lonelier than usual. Fences leaning, boards patched where storms had torn them loose, the chimney dark with no smoke. He tied the horse and helped her down, though she jerked her arm back as soon as her boots touched the dirt. The door opened with a groan. Inside, the air was cold and still. Nathan set wood in the stove and struck a flame. The fire caught slowly, crackling as it spread. The shadows lifted just enough to show the bare table, the single chair, the bed pushed into the corner. Ayoka looked around without a word. Her eyes settled on the small window where two wooden crosses could be seen in the distance. Nathan caught her gaze when she turned back, and though neither spoke, both knew what she had seen. He pulled off his coat and set it across her shoulders. The firelight caught her face, softening the sharp lines of her expression. She pulled the coat tight, holding it closed at her chest. Nathan turned back to the stove, his hands rough against the iron door, his thoughts heavy. For years, silence had filled this cabin, a silence he thought he needed. Now another presence stood in it, quiet but undeniable. And for the first time since the fever had taken everything from him, the silence no longer belonged to him alone. The cabin walls popped and settled as the fire found its strength, sending thin light across the room. Nathan stacked 2 more logs inside before closing the iron door, the orange glow pushing back against the shadows. He kept his movement steady, though his mind churned. He had not spoken more than a handful of words since leaving town, and now the silence felt heavier. He wondered what she thought of him, wondered if she thought him no different from the man in the market, another buyer with a claim. He caught himself clenching his jaw and forced it loose. Ayoka stood by the wall, holding his coat closed at her chest, her dark hair falling forward as she studied the room. The corners were bare, no sign of a woman's hand in the space. Only a chair, a table, shelves holding a few jars, and a bed with a rough quilt. Her eyes shifted toward the small window again, where the 2 crosses leaned into the wind. She seemed to understand without asking, her gaze lowering when she turned back. Nathan cleared his throat, the sound rough from disuse. There's water at the pump outside, wood stacked against the wall. Food's not much. His voice came out low, even as if he were talking more to himself than to her. She gave a small nod, her eyes steady. He noticed then what anyone would have seen but what the noise of the auction had hidden. Her wrists raw where the rope had cut, her dress torn more than he realized, the neckline frayed, one seam split along her side. He turned away, moving to a shelf where he kept a folded blanket. He sat on the bed and stepped back. Use that tonight. The bed's yours. He pulled the chair closer to the fire, making it clear enough that he would sleep there. She looked at him a long moment before lowering herself onto the edge of the bed. She did not thank him, but her shoulders eased as she pulled the blanket across her lap. The firelight warmed her face, softening the hard edges of fear. For the first time since he had seen her on the platform, she did not look like she was waiting to be struck. The night passed with only the wind scratching at the walls. Nathan sat awake longer than he meant to, his mind circling what had happened in town. He should have brought back grain. He should have walked away. Yet every time doubt pressed against him, he remembered the look in her eyes when the rope was cut, something between fear and defiance, something he had not seen in years. He closed his eyes finally, boots still on, the fire dimming. At dawn, The smell of smoke woke him. He sat up to find her crouched by the stove, feeding small sticks into the fire. His coat was folded neatly over the chair, the blanket pulled around her shoulders. The torn dress was still the only thing she had, but she wore it differently now, the blanket pinned to cover the neckline. She glanced up as he stirred, her eyes sharp with awareness. Not panic, not trust, but something balanced between. Nathan rose and pulled on his boots. He felt the question rising in him, one he had ignored the night before. You got people somewhere? Family. She hesitated before answering. Her voice was quiet, accented but clear. No one. It was the truth, or close enough. He nodded once, not pressing further. The question would have come sooner or later, and now it hung in the air between them. He moved outside to the pump, worked the handle until water spilled cold into the bucket. The air bit at his skin, the sun still low behind thin clouds. He thought of his neighbors, men who might have seen him in town. He thought of the stairs when word spread that Nathan Cole had brought an Apache woman into his home. He felt the weight of it, but the decision was already made. She was here now. When he stepped back inside, she had cleared the small table, setting 2 tin cups out, though she had not touched the food on the shelf. Nathan noticed the restraint. She was hungry. Anyone could see it in the way her eyes lingered on the jars, but she waited. That detail pressed at him harder than words. He set the bucket down and poured water into the cups. Their hands brushed when he passed one to her. She froze, eyes flicking to his face. He pulled back quick, not wanting her to think it meant more than it did. But the moment stayed. The day began with work. Nathan pulled his axe from the porch and set to splitting logs. The thud of wood striking the block echoed across the yard. After a time, he looked back and saw her at the pump, filling another bucket, hauling it inside. She moved carefully, as if each step tested her strength, but she did it without asking, without being told. Later, when he came in, his shirt damp with sweat from the chopping, he found the table wiped clean and his torn work shirt set aside with needle and thread pulled from his old tin. She had begun mending it. Nathan stopped in the doorway, his chest tightening. He had not asked her to do a thing. He had expected her to keep to herself, maybe sit by the fire in silence. Instead, she was fitting herself into the work of the place as if survival was something shared. That night, when the fire burned steady and the wind clawed outside, he found himself looking at her longer than he should. The coat hung near the door, the blanket wrapped around her as she sat near the hearth. She was still a stranger, but the silence no longer carried the same weight. Nathan lay back in the chair, eyes half closed, but sleep came harder. His thoughts circled, sharper now. He had nothing stored for winter. No sacks of grain, no corn. The money was gone. Yet when he glanced toward her, her shoulders no longer shaking in fear, he knew he would make do. He had chosen this, and he would see it through. The next morning brought a sky the color of iron, the kind of gray that pressed low over the plains and warned of harder weather moving in. Nathan stepped outside before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, his breath showing in the air as he carried the axe to the chopping block. His back and shoulders ached from the work of the day before, but that ache was something he trusted. It kept him steady. Each swing of the axe split the wood with a sharp crack that echoed against the cabin walls. He stacked the pieces in neat rows, knowing there would never be enough for a full winter, but refusing to leave it undone. Inside, Ayoka had already set the stove alight again. He could see the smoke curling from the chimney as he worked, and when he stepped back into the cabin, the air held warmth. She had found a pan from his shelves and managed to cook what little cornmeal remained in a tin. The smell of it filled the room, faint but steady. She had not asked him where anything was. She had searched, chosen, and done what she could. That quiet initiative unsettled him, not because it was unwelcome, but because it reminded him of a home he thought he'd lost forever. She set the pan on the table as he entered. Her hair hung loose, falling over her shoulders, and she had wrapped the blanket around herself again to cover the worst of the torn dress. She kept her eyes low, but he noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she held the spoon. She was not only cooking for him. She was testing the boundary between being an unwanted burden and becoming part of his survival. Nathan sat, accepted the bowl, and ate without comment. But when he was finished, he cleared his throat and said, "It's good." Simple words, but her shoulders eased, and that was enough. As the day stretched forward, he found himself watching her more closely. The questions that had gone unspoken since he'd cut her free in the market pressed harder now. Why had she been left alive when others from her people had been killed? Why had no one come searching? Why had she not tried to leave when the night was dark and the road open? He sensed that anyone hearing the story would ask the same. So, late in the afternoon, while he worked at mending the latch on the door and she sat near the stove threading his shirt, he asked, "Why were you in town?" Her needle paused, her eyes fixed on the cloth in her lap. After a long moment she spoke, her words careful, almost heavy. "Raid took my husband last spring. Soldiers burned our camp. They took some of us. The rest scattered." She shifted, fingers tightening on the fabric. "I was sold from one hand to another." Ended there. Nathan listened, his jaw set. He didn't press her further. The details she had given were enough. She had no family waiting, no camp to return to. She was alone, same as him, and whatever choices she had left were stripped down to the barest kind. His decision in the market no longer felt like impulse. It felt like the only thing left to do. Later, as dusk fell, he went outside to check the fences and the small pen where he once kept cattle. The posts leaned, the rails were broken in places, and the pen had been empty for more than a year. He ran his hand over the wood, rough and splintering, and thought of the coins he had spent. He could not bring back grain now. Winter would have to be met with whatever scraps he could gather. Yet when he turned back toward the cabin and saw smoke curling from the chimney, he felt a strange steadiness. The place did not look as empty as it had before. That night, the fire was strong, the logs stacked high. Ayoka sat near the hearth, her knees drawn close, the blanket still around her. Nathan lowered himself into the chair, the sound of wind scraping at the walls. Their eyes met briefly, and neither looked away. There was no smile, no words, but the silence between them shifted. He realized then something else an onlooker might have wondered. Why she did not fight him, why she had not lashed out when he cut her free, why she had come with him at all. She had been offered nothing but cruelty in the market, and yet his act, simple, quiet, had been enough. Not trust, not yet, but the barest proof that she could step forward instead of back. When Nathan rose to add another log to the fire, his hand brushed hers where she held the blanket closed. The touch was unplanned, brief, but left the air thicker between them. She did not pull away. He did not linger. Both sat back, the fire snapping in the silence. As the flames lit the room, Nathan thought of the winter ahead. Empty shelves, no grain, work that would break his back before spring. He thought of the graves outside, the promises he had failed to keep. Yet he also thought of her at the stove that morning, her hands steadying despite the tremble, the way she had mended his shirt without asking, the way she looked at the cabin as if it could become something more than a shelter. For the first time in years, Nathan felt the silence did not only belong to loss. It held the start of something else, fragile but real. And as the night closed in, he knew that when morning came, neither of them would face the day entirely alone. The morning broke with a hard wind that rattled the shutters and carried a cold bite sharper than the day before. Nathan rose from the chair with his back stiff, the weight of another night in it making his muscles ache. He rubbed his hands over his face, shook the sleep from his shoulders, and looked toward the bed. Ayoka was already up, folding the blanket she had used. She moved quietly, almost without sound, but not with the fearful hesitation she had carried that first night. He noticed the difference and held on to it as he pulled on his boots. He stepped outside and drew a breath of the dry air. The horizon stretched gray and empty, the kind of sky that could hold either snow or nothing at all. His eyes fell to the graves behind the cabin. He had not spoken of them, though he knew she had seen. Perhaps the people listening to their story would wonder who lay there, why those crosses leaned so weathered in the wind. Nathan let his hand rest against the top rail of the fence and gave the answer only to himself. His wife, Mary, and their boy, Samuel. Fever had taken them quick, and all he had left were 2 wooden markers and a silence that filled the years since. That silence had been easier to carry alone. Now he wondered if she thought the same of her own losses. When he returned inside, she was at the stove, coaxing heat from the embers. She had found the small tin of coffee, measured it out with care, and set the pot over the fire. Nathan's stomach tightened as he realized she was using supplies meant to stretch thin over weeks. But then he saw her face in the glow, focused, steady, not wasteful, but careful, and he let the thought pass. If she knew how to make what little they had last longer, he would not stop her. He sat at the table, his eyes drawn to her wrists as she worked. The rope burns still showed, raw in places. The audience might have wondered why he had not treated them, and truth pressed at him. He hadn't thought of it. He had been too focused on the grain he had not brought home, too wrapped in his own anger at the market. Now, seeing the marks, he spoke. There's salve in the box under the shelf. 4 cuts and burns. His voice came low, matter of fact. She glanced at him, then at her wrists, and gave the smallest nod. Later, she would find herself. The day drew them into work. Nathan took the axe again, his back bending to the rhythm of splitting logs. But before long he saw her outside, kneeling by the fence with a hammer and nails she must have found in his shed. She was pressing loose boards back into place. He stood for a moment, watching. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for his instruction. She saw something broken and set herself to mending it. He joined her, hammering the upper rails while she held them steady. Their eyes met briefly as the nail drove in. There were no words, but the work spoke clear enough. She wasn't waiting to be told she belonged. She was proving it herself. At midday, they ate together. Cornmeal again, thin and plain, but shared without awkwardness. Nathan caught himself wondering how long she had gone hungry before the auction, how many days she had been passed from one place to another. He wanted to ask, but he held his tongue. Questions could reopen wounds he couldn't heal, and she had already given him more truth than he deserved. That evening, after the sun dropped and the wind grew colder, they settled by the fire again. Nathan worked oil into the worn leather of his boots while Ayoka mended his shirt fully, the thread pulled clean through the fabric. When she finished, she rose and crossed the room. He felt his chest tighten as she held the shirt out to him. For a second their hands touched, longer this time, and though neither pulled away quickly, both felt the weight of the moment. Her eyes lifted to his, steady, almost questioning. He cleared his throat, his voice rough. "Thank you." 2 words, but more than he had spoken in months. She nodded, a faint shift of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to change the air between them. The fire snapped, the warmth pushing back the chill of the night. Nathan leaned back in the chair, his eyes drifting to the coat hanging near the door, the same coat he had set across her shoulders that first night. He thought of the questions others might ask. Why she hadn't tried to run, why she hadn't slipped out while he worked the fence or chopped wood. The truth showed itself plainly in the way she moved through his cabin now. She hadn't stayed because she was bound. She stayed because she had chosen, at least for now, not to leave. As the night deepened, he noticed her shiver. Without thinking, he rose, pulled the quilt from the bed, and set it across her shoulders by the fire. She looked up at him, surprised, her dark eyes holding his a moment longer than before. "You keep warm," he said simply. The words hung in the room, not as command but as care. Later, when the fire dimmed low and the only sound was the wind scratching outside, Nathan sat awake again in the chair. He watched her sleep near the hearth, the blanket drawn close. He thought of the graves outside, of the empty shelves, of the winter pressing down. But he also thought of the hammer in her hand by the fence, of her careful hands stirring cornmeal, of the thread moving steady through his shirt. His life had been nothing but loss for years, yet now, in this small cabin, he saw the shape of something else. He let out a long breath, shoulders easing for the first time in a long while. Whatever had brought her to him, whatever coin he had spent, no longer mattered. The question now was simpler. Could 2 broken lives stand the winter side by side? He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. The following days slipped into a rhythm, the kind of steady pattern that survival demanded. Nathan woke at first light, pulled on his boots, and went to work with the axe or checked the fences, while Ayoka kept the stove alive, patched clothing, and carried water from the pump. What had begun as cautious gestures, her mending his shirt, her cooking small meals without asking, slowly began to take on the weight of routine. Nathan noticed the change in himself before he admitted it aloud. Where once he expected only silence when he came back through the door, now the cabin always carried some sound. The scrape of a pot against the stove, the creak of floorboards as she moved, the soft pull of thread through cloth. The stillness that had haunted him for 3 years was no longer absolute. Questions hung between them, the kind a listener would wonder about. Why had she not slipped away during the long hours he spent outside? Why did she risk staying with a man she did not know? The answer revealed itself in small ways. Nathan saw her pause at the window some mornings, her gaze lingering on the horizon, the bare land offering nowhere safe to go. He saw how she touched the fresh repairs in the fence, as if testing the shape of belonging, and how she worked without being told. Leaving was not just dangerous, it meant returning to nothing. Here, at least, she had fire and food, however little. One evening, as the wind screamed harder against the walls, Nathan decided it was time to speak what he had kept quiet. He had thought of it often, and he knew it would weigh on her if left unsaid. After they finished a thin meal of beans and bread, he leaned back in the chair, his voice low. I buried my wife and boy behind this cabin. Fever took them 3 winters back. He let the words hang there, heavy, not dressed up, not softened. He hadn't spoken their names in months. Mary, Samuel. Ayoka's eyes met his. She did not lower her gaze, nor did she speak quickly. She simply nodded once, as though she understood the kind of loss that did not need long explanation. After a pause, she said, my husband was taken in a raid. He did not come back. Her tone was flat, not because it meant little, but because saying more would have broken the steadiness she had left. Their grief stood between them like 2 stones set side by side, not touching but not alone. For Nathan, it was the first time he felt his pain acknowledged by someone who knew its shape. That night, when the fire burned lower and the shadows leaned longer, she sat closer than before, the quilt drawn over her shoulders. Nathan shifted in his chair, restless, then finally moved to sit across from her on the floor by the hearth. The heat from the flames brushed both their faces, and the silence stretched long. When her hand moved to adjust the blanket, his fingers brushed hers again. This time neither of them looked away. It was then that the first real moment passed between them. He leaned slightly closer, testing if she would pull back. She didn't. Her breath caught faintly, but her eyes stayed fixed on his. Nathan's hand rose, rough and scarred, and paused before touching her cheek. When she did not flinch, he let it rest there. The warmth of her skin under his calloused palm sent a sharp ache through him, an ache of something returning he had thought gone forever. He kissed her then, slow, hesitant, almost as though asking permission even as it happened. Her lips pressed back, not forceful, not timid, but with a quiet certainty. The kiss was brief, but when they pulled apart, the fire cracked louder, and the room felt changed. Neither spoke of it, yet both knew they had crossed into something new. Later, when she lay under the quilt near the fire and he sat in the chair, neither slept quickly. He stared at the rafters, thinking of how the winter would test them. They had little grain, almost no reserves. But for the first time, he no longer thought in terms of only himself. His choices mattered for her now, too. And he knew listeners might wonder, what would become of them with so little to live on? His mind settled on the same answer he had carried through every hardship before. Work harder, endure, refuse to let go. He looked toward her before closing his eyes. She was watching him in the dim light, not with fear, but with something steadier. The kind of look that told him she had chosen, in her own way, to stay. The first snow came earlier than Nathan had expected. It began as a thin flurry, drifting across the plains in the late afternoon. But by nightfall, the flakes had thickened, carried hard against the cabin walls by the wind. By morning, the ground lay covered in a pale sheet that crunched under his boots when he stepped outside. The air stung his skin, sharper than any wind before. He pulled his coat tighter around him and knew what it meant. The hard months had arrived. Inside, Ayoka had kept the fire alive through the night. The cabin smelled of smoke and wood, with a faint trace of beans that had been boiled thin the evening before. She sat near the hearth, her knees pulled close, the quilt wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up when he entered, her expression calm but watchful. Nathan met her eyes briefly, then set about pulling more wood inside. He didn't say what both of them knew. Their food was too little, their supplies barely enough to last a handful of weeks. The money he had spent in town had bought her freedom, not grain. That truth pressed harder now that the snow had come. As he worked to stack wood by the stove, he thought of the questions that would be asked. How would they eat when the jars on the shelf were nearly empty? Why had he risked everything for her? Nathan knew the answer, but had not said it. He hadn't been able to walk away, not after seeing the ropes on her wrists and the look in her eyes. And now that she was here, he would not let her go hungry if he could help it. That day he set his rifle on his shoulder and told her he would hunt. The plains held little, but there were still rabbits, sometimes deer in the brush near the river. She rose as if to go with him. Nathan paused, weighing the risk. He knew listeners would wonder why he hadn't asked her sooner about her own skills, about what she could do beyond mending and tending the stove. He realized he didn't know if she had hunted before, didn't know what she carried from her life before captivity. You know the land? He asked finally, his voice even. Ayoka gave a small nod. I hunted with my brother when we were young. I know the signs. She lifted her chin, not boastful, but firm. Nathan studied her for a moment, then handed her his spare knife. Stay close then. They moved out into the snow together. The cold bit hard at their hands and faces, the silence broken only by the crunch of their steps. Nathan scanned the ground for tracks, but it was she who spotted the faint line of rabbit prints first, pointing toward the brush. Her movements were quiet, practiced, though he could see the strain in her shoulders, memories of another life rising with every step. By late afternoon, they had caught 2 rabbits. Small, barely enough, but it was something. Nathan skinned them by the cabin while she set water to boil. They worked side by side, the tasks falling into a rhythm that needed no words. When the meal was ready, they ate slowly, each bite measured, but both felt the weight of relief. That night, as the fire burned against the cold, Nathan found himself watching her more closely than before. She sat across from him, her hair loose, her face warmed by the flames. The quilt had slipped from her shoulders, and she pulled it back slowly, her eyes catching his for a brief moment before lowering again. The memory of their kiss lingered in his chest, sharp and heavy. He wondered if she thought of it too. He reached for the shirt she had mended, the stitches neat and strong. You did good work, he said, holding it up. She looked at him, surprised by the words, then gave a small nod. Her eyes softened just enough that the tension between them grew stronger. Questions still pressed. Why had she not spoken more of her family? Did she carry children somewhere, hidden or lost? Did she regret staying? Nathan saw the weight on her face and chose not to force the answers. Instead, he offered what he could. I'll keep this place standing. Wood, water, food. You don't have to wonder. Her gaze lifted to his again. For the first time, there was no distance in it. Only the faintest sign of trust, fragile but real. When the fire had dimmed and they settled for sleep, the cold drove them closer. She lay near the hearth under the quilt, but the wind rattled the walls so hard that Nathan rose from his chair and set another quilt on the floor nearby. She shifted, looking at him, her expression unreadable. After a pause, she lifted the edge of the blanket she held. A silent offer. Nathan hesitated, his chest tight, then lowered himself beside her. The warmth of her body against his was unfamiliar, almost unbearable after years of loneliness. Neither spoke. Their breaths slowed, their shoulders brushed, and in the dark the silence no longer felt like emptiness but like the first fragile shape of belonging. The snow did not let up. By the second week, it lay in deep banks around the cabin, piled high against the fences Nathan had repaired and creeping up to the porch. The cold was constant, the kind that seeped into the bones and tested every crack in the cabin walls. Nathan worked each day to split more wood, his breath showing in heavy clouds as he carried logs inside. while Ayoka kept the stove alive, stretched what little food they had, and found new ways to make it last. Inside, the air grew thick with the smell of burning wood and boiled rabbit. Ayoka had turned scraps into stew, adding dried beans sparingly, portioning out each meal with a care that Nathan could not help but notice. He realized then something the audience might have wondered since the beginning. What skills did she truly bring with her, beyond silence and survival? The answer showed itself in her steady hands and the way she managed small things so they became enough. Nathan had lived with hunger before, but she made the little they had stretch in ways he hadn't thought possible. He found himself watching her work, the way she moved around the stove, the quiet focus in her face. Each task seemed deliberate, every motion careful, and he wondered how much of it had been shaped by years of hardship. His chest tightened as he thought of her in the market, the jeers of men, the ropes cutting into her wrists. He caught himself gripping the edge of the table, jaw clenched. He had bought her freedom, but the weight of what she had endured did not lift easily. One evening, after another long day of chopping wood and checking snares, Nathan sat by the fire, his hands rough with blisters, his shoulders aching. Ayoka came from the hearth with a strip of cloth and a small jar of the salve he had pointed out days earlier. Without asking, she took his hand. Her touch was light but firm as she worked the ointment into the raw skin. Nathan stiffened at first and used to being tended to, but then let the tension leave him. He studied her face as she worked, calm, steady, her dark hair falling across her cheek. When she finished, she looked up, her eyes holding his longer than before. There was no fear in them now. He felt the silence press between them, heavier than words. He wanted to speak, to tell her what he had not yet said, but his throat locked. Instead, he covered her hand with his rough over soft and left it there. That night, they did not sit apart. The cold was too sharp and the fire too small to hold it back. Nathan lay down near the hearth, pulling one quilt over them both. Ayoka did not hesitate. She moved close, her body warming against his, her hand resting lightly at his chest. Their breaths fell into rhythm, the blanket rising and falling with each one. Nathan lay still, every muscle tight with the nearness of her, but he did not pull away. It was in that quiet that more questions found their answers. Some might have wondered if she would ever truly trust him, if her choice to stay was born only of survival. But as she leaned against him, her face resting near his shoulder, Nathan understood. She had chosen not out of fear, not out of lack of options, but because in this place she had found something she had lost before: safety. Hours passed before he allowed himself to sleep. When he finally did, it was with the weight of her against him and the sound of the wind outside fading into something less sharp. The next day brought another trial. Nathan set out with a rifle, determined to find more food. He left her by the stove with instructions to keep the fire strong. The land stretched cold and empty, the snow making every step heavier. Hours passed before he returned, a deer slung across the sled he had rigged. His breath came ragged, his face raw from wind, but he had done it. When Ayoka saw the deer, her eyes widened, relief and gratitude breaking across her face in a way he had not seen before. She moved quickly, helping him haul it inside, setting water to boil, readying the knives. They worked together without pause, cutting, salting, preparing the meat. The shelf that had stood nearly bare now held enough to promise weeks of survival. That evening, the cabin glowed with the smell of cooking venison. Nathan sat at the table, his hands too tired to move, watching her move with a grace that felt more at home than any silence he had lived with in years. When she set a plate before him, she did not sit apart. She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. He turned his head, caught her gaze, and this time did not hold back. He leaned close and kissed her again, deeper than before, the firelight catching both their faces. She kissed him back, her hand rising to rest against his cheek. When they pulled apart, Nathan let the words come, low but certain. "You're not here because I bought you. You're here because you chose to be." Her eyes softened, and for the first time she spoke with no hesitation. "I stay because I want to." The fire burned steady, the snow pressing against the cabin walls, but inside the air had changed. What had begun in silence now held something stronger. Neither was alone anymore. The storm held them inside for 3 more days. Snow pressed high against the walls, the windows rimmed in frost. Nathan and Ayoko worked by the firelight, tending meat, patching clothing, and stacking wood so the cold never crept too far in. The rhythm of their days had shifted. No longer a silence between strangers, but something steadier, something that carried the weight of choice. Still, Nathan knew the world outside their cabin had not forgotten them. He thought often of the market in Las Cruces, the faces of men who had seen him lay coin for her, men who had spat in the dirt when the hammer fell, angry that she had not been theirs. He hadn't spoken of it, but the thought stayed with him like a shadow. He knew the audience would wonder, too, why no one had come knocking yet, and whether trouble would find them. On the 4th morning, he had his answer. He was cutting a path through the snow with his shovel when the sound of hooves reached him, muffled by distance but clear against the still air. He straightened, his grip tightening on the handle. 2 riders appeared along the ridge, moving slow, the steam of their horses rising in the cold. They were men from town. Nathan recognized them by their coats, by the way they sat their saddles, traders, but not ones he trusted. Ayoka stepped onto the porch, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. She looked at him, waiting. Nathan set the shovel aside, brushing snow from his gloves. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low. She hesitated, then obeyed, slipping back into the cabin, though not before giving him one last steady look. The men stopped their horses just short of the yard. One spat into the snow, his face half hidden by a scarf. "Heard you brought yourself company, Cole," he called. His tone was sharp, mocking. "Apache girl. Pretty one." "That true." Nathan stood straight, his face unreadable. "She's here." The second man leaned on his saddle horn, smirking. "Fella don't buy grain in winter unless he's buying something else. Word is you spent good coin on her." His eyes narrowed. "Some of us think you owe the town. Ain't right you keep her shut away out here, while others—" Nathan cut him off with a voice like iron. "She's not for sale, not for trade, not yours." The men shifted, uneasy, but one pressed harder. "Men, don't forget, Cole. That coin could have bought food, stock, things the town needed. You keep her, you make enemies." Nathan's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, his boots sinking in the snow. "Then let them come to me. I'll say it plain, she stays." His hand rested at his side, not on his gun, but close enough that the message carried. The men studied him, weighing the strength in his eyes, the steadiness in his stance. Finally, one cursed under his breath and tugged his reins. "Your choice, Cole." But choices carry weight. They turned and rode off, their horses cutting tracks back toward town. When Nathan stepped back inside, Ayoko was waiting by the stove. She had heard enough, the words, the tone. Her face was calm, but her hands twisted the edge of the quilt. Nathan set his gloves aside, his voice even. "Men in town don't like what I did. They think you're theirs." She lifted her chin, her dark eyes steady. "And you?" He didn't hesitate. "You're not theirs. You're not bought anymore. You're free to leave if you choose. But if you stay, then you stay with me." The words hung in the warm air, sharper than any oath he had spoken in years. For a long moment, she said nothing, only studying his face as though testing the weight of his truth. Then she stepped closer, letting the quilt fall from her shoulders. She placed her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath. "I stay." It was not just survival now. It was not just the sharing of food or fire. It was the answer to every question unspoken since the market. The reason she hadn't run, the reason she had mended his shirt, cooked his meals, sat close by the fire. That night, they shared more than warmth under the quilt. Their closeness deepened, not rushed, not forced, but chosen. Nathan felt the years of emptiness break as her body pressed against his, her breath steady against his skin. He had thought he would never hold someone again, but here she was, not given to him, not taken, but choosing. In the quiet after, as the fire burned low, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "The town may come again," he said. "They may test us." She whispered back, her voice low but unshaken. "Then we face them together." The wind scraped at the cabin walls, but inside the silence carried no emptiness. It held two voices, two hearts, and the first fragile shape of a family beginning again. The snow had not eased by the time a week passed since the riders came. The drift stood higher than the fence rails now, the land a hard white that stretched without end. Nathan and Ayoka worked side by side to keep the cabin alive, splitting wood, boiling meat, tending snares when the weather broke just enough to step outside. The rhythm of their days had become steady, but Nathan knew the piece they had carved would not go untested. On the 8th morning, the sound of horses came again, this time more than two. Nathan heard them before he saw them, his gut tightening the way it always had when trouble came close. He opened the cabin door and stepped onto the porch. 6 men rode across the ridge, their shapes dark against the snow. They moved slow, their eyes set on the cabin, their breath rising in plumes of white. Ayoka joined him at the door, her face calm, though her hand tightened at the edge of the quilt she wore. Nathan looked at her briefly before stepping down into the snow, his boots crunching hard. He didn't draw his rifle from its place by the door, but he rested his hand close to the holster at his hip. The men stopped a short distance from the yard. Their leader, a thick-shouldered trader named Colby, pushed his scarf down and spat. "You've made yourself a problem, Cole," Colby called, his voice rough against the wind. "We told you once, coin like that belonged to the town. You don't get to shut her away out here. She ain't yours." Nathan's voice came even, steady. "She's not yours either. She's not for trade. She's free." The men muttered among themselves, shifting in their saddles. Colby sneered. "Free? An Apache woman, taken at market? You think folks will stand for that? You keep her here, you'll be standing against every man who's ever lost kin to her kind." The words cut sharp, and Nathan knew the truth in them. Prejudice ran deep, and men like Colby clung to it. He felt Ayoka's presence behind him, silent but steady, and that steadiness grounded him. He stepped forward, snow breaking under his boots. "I buried my wife and son 3 winters back," Nathan said, his voice carrying across the cold. "The ground out there don't care what blood runs in a person's veins. It takes the good same as the bad. You come here thinking she's less than you, you're wrong. She works this land same as I do. She stays because she chooses to. And I'll tell you plain, she's under my roof, and I'll protect her as long as I draw breath." The silence that followed was heavy. The men shifted again, some looking away. Colby's jaw tightened, his eyes burning with the kind of anger that came when truth pressed harder than hate. He spat into the snow once more, then tugged his reins. "You'll regret it, Cole. Mark me." With that, he turned his horse, and the others followed, their figures shrinking against the horizon until only the wind remained. Nathan stood in the yard a long while after, watching until they were gone. When he finally turned back, Ayoka was still at the door. She stepped forward, laying her hand against his chest. He covered it with his own, rough over soft, holding it there as his breath steadied. That night, the fire burned bright, the cabin filled with a warmth that no storm could strip away. They sat close, their shoulders touching, their eyes meeting in the glow. Nathan felt the weight of years of silence lifting, the ache of loss loosening at last. He looked at her, and this time he did not hold back. "I want you here, not because I bought you, not because of debt or pity. I want you as mine, if you'll have me." Her dark eyes softened, and for the first time a true smile touched her lips, faint but steady. "I stay," she said, the same words as before, but now stronger, carrying more than survival. They carried choice, love, and the beginning of a new life. Nathan leaned forward and kissed her, slow but sure, the firelight catching them both. The kiss was not hesitation now, it was promise. When they pulled apart, Ayoka rested her head against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The winter outside would be long, the land unforgiving. But the cabin was no longer silent, no longer hollow. It was home. The graves out back would always stand, but now they stood beside a hearth that burned bright with new life. Nathan knew Mary and Samuel would not be forgotten, but he also knew the time had come to live again. As the wind scraped at the shutters and the snow climbed higher against the walls, Nathan and Ayoka sat together, no longer alone, no longer bound by the past. The story that had begun in the dust of the market ended here, in a cabin lit by fire, in two hands holding, in the quiet certainty that love had taken root where loss once lived. And when morning came, the world outside was still white and cold, but inside, the cabin was theirs, alive, steady, and unbroken.